The Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God, Mother of Sorrows, does not come to take away the cross of Christ, but rather to give it. She came to Lourdes in 1857 to heal the sick, and since then she has healed there thousands whose cures scientific medicine cannot explain. But the majority who come to Lourdes are not healed, but go back to home or hospital to bear their cross anew, to suffer and die. She came to Fatima in 1917 during the First World War in response to Pope Benedict XV's anguished prayers for peace, for an end to the horrible and pointless slaughter of that war. She asked more prayers for peace and finally announced that peace would come, only to be followed by another still greater war and by the advance of a great new evil out of Russia to spread all over the world. When she came to Tepeyac in 1531 after the conquest of Mexico, she brought about the conversion of its people, but that conversion has been followed by much oppression and persecution. The story of that oppression and persecution in Mexico, oppression by many of the wealthy and powerful among the descendants of the first Spanish settlers, and persecution by the anti-Catholic governments that have dominated Mexico most of the time since 1832, has often been told. What has hardly been told at all is the far more important story of the preservation of the faith in Mexico despite it all. There has never been a major anti-Catholic movement among the ordinary people of Mexico. Virtually all the hostility to the faith has come from a small elitist minority. This fact becomes much more remarkable when it is realized that for 300 years the Mexican church had no priests of its own. All of its priests were Spanish. And with the passage of time from the heroic missionary era of the 16th century, many of these Spanish priests became far removed in spirit and sometimes in body from the people they were intended to serve. There were always noble exceptions, but not nearly enough to account for the unwavering constancy of faith in Catholic Mexico. The Virgin of Guadalupe accounts for it. She had said to Juan Diego, whose coming canonization we're about to celebrate, quote, "Listen and be sure, my dear son, that I will protect you. Do not be frightened or grieve, or let your heart be dismayed. Am I not here? I who am your mother, and is not my help or refuge? Am I not of your kind?" End quote. Against every oppressor, against every persecutor, her figure stood. Maria Morena, the dark virgin, gentle, loving, invulnerable, inextinguishably shining. Neither narrow-minded later Spaniards who disapproved of her two common associations — there has always been a certain type of Christian who tends to find Mary very undignified — nor anti-Catholic fanatics who saw the church as the supreme obstacle to what they called progress, dared for centuries to touch her. But they could not forget that she was there. Finally, in perhaps the greatest crisis of Mexican history after the conquest itself, when the revolutionary Constitution of 1917, the year Mary appeared at Fatima — remember, there are no coincidences in God — had turned over full control of the church in Mexico to the bitterly anti-Catholic government of Obregón and Calles, the church's enemies struck at Our Lady of Guadalupe directly. A bomb was concealed in a bouquet of flowers placed under her sacred image on November 14, 1921. It exploded during Mass. Pieces of stone were ripped from the sanctuary. The force of the explosion twisted a heavy metal cross on the altar into an almost circular shape. But not one worshiper in the packed church was hurt, and the sacred image was absolutely untouched. A chapel of reparation was later added to the Church of Our Lady of Guadalupe with a twisted cross placed in it to remind the faithful of the evil that had struck and the protection that had been given. The symbolism was also profound. For it is the cross that good Christians must bear, the cross that represents both the power of the forces of destruction and the means of redemption. But the Mother of God is forever safe, and her portrait belongs to the Catholic people of Mexico and will not be taken from them. Mexico's faith survived Obregón and Calles as it had survived all its enemies before them, aided by the crusading heroes known as the Cristeros, who fought them in the spirit of Hernán Cortés and Bernal Diaz, until the worst of the anti-Catholic laws were withdrawn. In recent years, the Mexican government has become less hostile to the faith. Millions greeted Pope John Paul II when on January 27, 1979, he became the first pope to visit the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe and to behold directly the portrait of the Mother of God, to whom he has a very special devotion. Remember the Cristeros who fought for the faith in Mexico in 1920. When years ago I was giving a speech in El Paso, Texas, where some of them now live, I said, maybe there's someone in this audience who fought with the Cristeros. And after my speech, one grizzled old man came up and said, I was there. So these people are still around. Our Lady of Guadalupe is not only the happiness of Mexico. Every well-authenticated personal appearance of the Mother of God in history is immensely significant to the whole world. No more than it could be a coincidence that there were 5 million Indian baptisms in Mexico in the first 5 years after she appeared on the hill of Tepeyac. Can it be a coincidence that in those same 5 years, 1532 to 1536, those same 5 years were the years that England left the Catholic Church? In April 1532, just 5 months after the apparition in New Mexico, the clergy of England formally submitted to the authority of Henry VIII, who was demanding an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, which Pope Clement VII had refused on the best of grounds to grant. The next month, St. Thomas More resigned as Chancellor of England because his king was moving into rebellion against the church Christ founded. In May 1533, Thomas Cranmer, Henry VIII's choice as Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest ecclesiastical church office in England, recognized Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, and in July, Pope Clement excommunicated the King of England. In March 1534, Parliament declared the final severance of the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church and ordered all its members, clergymen, and public officials to take an oath recognizing the legitimacy of the King's marriage despite the declaration of the Pope. St. Thomas More refused to take this oath. In November 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, making Henry VIII supreme head of the Church of England. The clergy were required to take an oath accepting that as well. Only one bishop, St. John Fisher, refused. He was martyred for it on June 22, 1535. St. Thomas More was martyred July 6, 1535. In April 1536, Parliament and King, prodded by the rapacious Thomas Cromwell, expropriated the land and all the property of every monastery in England. The parallel is breathtakingly precise, diamond clear. As the people of England went out of the church Christ founded, the people of Mexico came into it. The consequences to the church of the loss of England reverberate down the centuries. She has suffered few greater losses in the whole of the Christian era. The consequences to the church of the conversion of the majority of the population of the New World who live south of the United States still lie mostly in the future. But no part of the world is more Catholic, and few equally so. And that, above all, is the gift of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Now let's look for a few minutes at the historical authentication of this apparition, which some incredibly have denied against overwhelming evidence. There is a document which we have available written in the Aztec Indian language of Nahuatl, which is called the Nican Mapohua, which means in Nahuatl, herein it is told. I want to read a few comments about this vitally important document in a recent book about Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is very good, which I recommend very highly, by Manuela Testoni. The most important document, apart from the image of the Virgin Mary itself on Juan Diego's tilma, is undoubtedly the Nican Mapohua, written in Nahuatl by an educated noble Indian, Antonio Valeriano. Proficient in 3 languages, Nahuatl, Spanish, and Latin, he had been a student at the College of Santa Cruz in Tlatelolco and served as an informant on Aztec history to Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, great Spanish authority on the Aztecs. Antonio Valeriano was considered by all to be a man of high moral character and above suspicion, not only by his fellow countrymen, but also by the Spanish civil and religious authorities. For 40 years, he was governor of the Indians of Mexico City. The document Nican Mapohua begins with those 2 words in Nahuatl, which mean herein is told. Herein it is told. The original account of the apparition was probably written around the middle of the 16th century, and according to the style of that period. Antonio Valeriano gave the document to a man who's an Aztec name, which I won't attempt to read, who left it to his son, Juan de Alva, who passed it on to a Jesuit. the Jesuit Carlos de Siguenza y Góngora. We'll say more about him in a minute. When he died, the document was left to the Jesuit College of Saints Peter and Paul in Mexico City. With the expulsion of the Jesuits from all Spanish territories in 1767, the document was lost. But the document did exist, as we'll see the proof that we have. Oops. Thank you so much. Now, the first step that was taken toward authenticating this vitally important document is one of my favorite stories. A copy was found by a Jesuit scholar named Father Burris, whom I've had the privilege to meet on a speaking platform, and he found it, you'll never guess where, some obscure monastery in Mexico. No, he found it in the New York Public Library. Right there, and nobody ever located it. Nobody ever even looked before he did. Surprising how often that's true. So he found a very early copy there. Then this man that was just mentioned in the Testoni book, Carlos de Siguenza y Góngora, a great authority on Mexican culture, verified under oath that Antonio Valeriano was the author of the Nican Mapoa and that he had seen and held the original document in his own hands. Recently, a codex, which is the word for an Aztec document, dated 1548, the year of Juan Diego's death, was discovered, examined, and the paper and ink were tested in 1996 by a special commission in Mexico City, and they were declared to be authentic. It's reproduced on page 115 of Testoni's book. This document includes a statement, a signed written statement that Our Lady of Guadalupe did appear as the Nican Mapoa described. Then in the year 1666, there was a series of hearings called by the Spanish word informaciones. These were requested by Pope Alexander VII, the Pope at the time, and this involved the questioning of 8 Indian witnesses who in that year, 1666, were 90 to 115 years old. 90 to 115. This is 135 years after the apparition. But they were old enough to remember having talked to people who did remember it. This illustrates particularly well a very important concept in the history, which I've lectured about many times, living memory. When you still have somebody alive who remembers the event or knew someone and talked with someone who was. This is one of the ways you authenticate the scriptures, by being within living memory. Living memory can be dated to be approximately twice 90 years, because a person living to be 90 years old usually remembers some things of his youth and accurately. He knows that there's been a distortion of the truth of what happened, and he knows that he talked with people who knew about what happened. And these hearings included a statement by a man named Luis Becerra Tanco, who declared that he had talked with elderly people who had known Blessed Juan Diego personally. Not only is living memory a powerful tool of getting historical correctness and finding out what the real truth is about events in history, but there's also oral tradition. I know something about oral tradition. I come from rural Maine, where oral tradition was preserved very exceptionally well. I want to illustrate this. My grandfather, who was born in 1871, preserved the memory of the battle in which his ancestor James Warren, from whom I named, had fought against Oliver Cromwell in 1651. He preserved the memory of that battle. He even pronounced it in a strange way, not the Battle of Dunbar, which is the way we usually say it, but the Battle of Dunbar. I can hear him saying it now. And he preserved the memory of that battle that his ancestor had fought in, and he preserved the memory of that ancestor being sent across the Atlantic by Oliver Cromwell to be an indentured servant in Maine, and even preserved the memory of his shipmates. The list of his shipmates, and I checked that out in the original document that described that. Over 300 years, he preserved that memory. That's the way oral tradition works, if you live in a place where it's still alive. So we have overwhelming evidence that this really happened. And that's the reason that Juan Diego was going to be canonized this year, because the Vatican believes this evidence, even though there are some so-called scholars in Mexico who still won't accept it, I understand. Now, why did Our Lady come to Mexico? Let's see what the situation was at the time of her apparition. It was of almost incredible horror. And this evidence comes from secular scholars, not Catholic scholars, who are just reporting what happened. Every Aztec city and large town had a central square from which a high temple in the shape of a pyramid arose, and 4 gates opened upon 4 roads approaching the town in straight lines, extending at least 5 miles, each ending at one side of the temple pyramid. On one side of the temple pyramid was a steep stairway to its top. The whole structure was skillfully tapered inward, suggesting even greater height than the 90 to 100 feet that was common. Month after month, year after year, at temple after temple, the sacrificial victims came down the rows to the steps, climbed up the steps to the platform at the top, and there were bent backwards over large convex slabs of polished stone by a hook around the neck, wielded by a priest with head and arms stained black, never cut black hair all caked and matted with dried blood, and once white garments stoked and stained with innumerable gouts of crimson. An immense knife with a blade of black volcanic glass rose and fell, cutting the victim open. His heart was torn out while still beating and held up for all to see, while his ravaged body was kicked over the edge of the temple platform, where it bounced and slithered in obscene contortions down the steps to the bottom 100 feet below. Later, the limbs of the body were eaten. Many primitive peoples have practiced occasional human sacrifice, and some have practiced cannibalism. None has ever done so on a scale remotely approaching that of the Aztecs. No one will ever know how many they sacrificed, but the law of the empire required 1,000 sacrifices to the Aztec tribal god Huitzilopochtli in every town with a temple every year. And there were 371 subject towns in the Aztec Empire, though not all of them had full-scale temples. There were many other sacrifices as well. The total number was at least 50,000 a year, probably much more. An early Mexican historian estimated that 1 out of every 5 children in Mexico was sacrificed. It is known that entire tribes, numbering in the tens of thousands, were exterminated by sacrifice. The 2 chief gods of the Aztec pantheon, to which most of the sacrifices were made, were the Aztecs' own god, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird wizard, called lover of hearts and drinker of blood, and the principal deity of Mexico, Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, lord of the dark, god of phantoms and monsters, demiurge of creation, he who is at the shoulder as the tempter. An almost universal symbol in Mexican religion was the serpent. Sacrifices were heralded by the prolonged beating of an immense drum made of the skins of huge snakes, which could be heard 2 miles away. Nowhere else in human history has Satan so formalized and institutionalized his worship with so many of his own actual titles and symbols. In the year 1487, the Aztec emperor, whose name was Tlaquiel, decided that a new temple should be dedicated in Mexico City with the greatest mass sacrifice of his 58 years of dominance of the Aztec Empire. As always, he had his way. In the memorable description of R.C. Padden, not a Catholic historian, quote, well before daybreak of the opening day, legionnaires prepared the victims, who were put in close single file down the steps of the Great Pyramid, through the city, over the causeways, and out as far as the eye could see. For the average person viewing the spectacle from his rooftop, it would appear that the victims stretched in lines to the ends of the earth. The bulk of the unfortunates were from hostile provinces and the swollen ranks of slavery. On the pyramid's summit, 4 slabs had been set up, one at the head of each staircase, for Tlaquiel and the 3 kings of the Triple Alliance, all of whom were to begin the affair as sacrificial priests. All were in readiness. The lines of victims were strung out for miles, with great reservoirs at their ends, thousands of trapped humans milling about like cattle, awaiting their turn in the line that was about to move. Suddenly, the brilliantly arrayed kings appeared on the platform, and silence fell over the city. Together they approached Huitzilopochtli's chapel and made reverent obeisance. As they turned to join their aides at the 4 slabs, great snakeskin drums began to throb, announcing that the lines could now begin to move. End of quote from Patton. Relays of priests dispatched the victims. As each group tired, others of the thousands who were to live below them in the new temple stepped forward to relieve them and keep up the pace. Years of practice had given them a skill and a speed almost incredible. Reliable evidence indicates that it took only 15 seconds to kill each victim. Blood and bodies cascaded in an endless stream down the temple steps. Hearts were assembled in piles and skulls in racks. It went on for 4 days and 4 nights. More than 80,000 men were killed. Tlaquiel had commanded all the high nobility of Mexico to be present, watching from scented, rose-covered boxes. But eventually the bonds of custom and even of fear were burst by overwhelming horror, and most of the spectators fled, along with many of the people of the city. Even those who could hide from the sight of what was happening were unable any longer to endure the stench. It would be a hardy soul who would undertake to make a catalog of all the horrors of history and try to make comparisons among them. But still, no scene after the Passion of Christ would seem to have quite so good a claim to be the worst of all as this one in Mexico City in the year 1487. In this year, in the town of Cuautitlan, on the shore of Salt Lake Texcoco, 12 miles south of Mexico City, there lived a boy of 13 who had probably already begun to learn the trade of maker of reed mats by which he was later to earn his living. His name was Cuauhtloac, he who talks like an eagle. An eagle perched on a cactus growing out of rock with a snake in its beak was the symbol of Mexico City. Approximately 40 years later, Cuauhtloac was to be baptized with the Christian name of Juan Diego, and it was to him that the Mother of God, who crushes the serpent, was to appear on the nearby hill of Tepeyac as Our Lady of Guadalupe. But the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Mother of the Church, does not act alone. She has sons and she has daughters who also have their part to play in the achievement of good and the destruction of evil. Within the sharply limited world of Mexico in 1487, no possible source of rescue could be seen. Christianity had never been preached. The victimized people did not know to whom to pray to have help. Their lifelong training and orientation was to believe that Tlaquiel's system was not only the right one, but the only one. Theirs was a voiceless cry, voiceless even in the language of the Spirit, a dumb agony, a rending pain without remedy that cried out to heaven for the vengeance that is the Lord's and the rescue that can be man's. Eastward, toward the sunrise, rolled the ocean. Across the ocean was the land of Spain, where there was a great queen named Isabel, who was more than a world apart from Tlaquiel and the human sacrifices. And from Isabel, Spain, Christopher Columbus was to sail across the Atlantic and open up Mexico to the penetration of the Spaniards, to save them from the evil that had engulfed them. In that same year, 1487, when the 80,000 were torn apart in 4 days on the altar of the hummingbird wizard, 2 lived in Spain whose future was to be bound up in a far more intimate way with Mexico than the future Queen Isabel or Columbus, neither of whom ever saw or learned of it, despite all they did, which ultimately made its physical and spiritual conquest possible. One was a boy of 19 from Vizcaya, the Basque province in the north of Spain, round-faced, solemn, resolute, devoted, probably beginning about then his Franciscan novitiate. His name was Juan de Tumarga, and he would be the Bishop of Mexico for 18 years and the first to see the picture of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The other was not yet even a boy, but a baby who had barely learned to walk and talk. His father, Martin Cortes de Monroy, was a poor squire in Extremadura, section of Spain. Martin Cortes lived at Medellin, an out-of-the-way place on the Guadiana River about 20 miles east of ancient Merida, commanded like so many towns in Spain with a stormy history by a frowning great castle. The baby was sickly. The family chose St. Peter for his special patron, praying often to the Prince of the Apostles and the Rock of the Church to ask his intercession for this child, as he himself did when he grew old enough to understand. This baby's name was Hernan, and he was to conquer Mexico for Christ and Spain. This is Hernan Cortes, the greatest and best of all the conquistadors, against odds of 10,000 to 1. He overthrew the devil and the devil gods and made it possible for this land to be freed by Our Lady, as we're going to see how it's done. So now let's come back to Juan Diego, who Cortez made it possible for the missionaries to reach Mexico, and in Mexico they began converting people. One of the first they converted was this man Juan Diego, and he, by the time of the apparition, he was 55 years old. He had been a convert for some time, and his wife, to whom he was devoted, had just died. There's been a lot of talk about what class of men he came from. The evidence is that he was lower middle class, and he lived with after his wife died, he lived with his uncle Juan Bernardino, and that's the immediate background for the apparition itself, which is one of the greatest stories in all of Catholic history. You probably all heard it, but it won't do any harm to hear it again. At dawn, Saturday, December 9th, 1531, the day after the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, Juan Diego was on his way from the village of Tolpetlac near Cuautitlan, where he now lived, to Tlatelolco for morning mass, which he attended every day he possibly could. His route ran over the hill of Tepeyac and across the Tepeyac Causeway to Tlatelolco next to Mexico City, where Gonzalo de Sandoval had fought his way during the Great Siege 10 years earlier. As Juan Diego came to the summit of the hill, he heard singing and saw a brilliant white cloud aureoled in rainbow. The white light was coming from the midst of the cloud and was intensely bright. A beautiful young woman appeared before the cloud, her clothes shining so gloriously they seemed to turn rocks into pendants of jewels, cactus leaves into emeralds, cactus trunks into gold. When the Blessed Virgin Mary first appeared at Fatima in Portugal 386 years later, in May 1917, Lucia saw her clad in a white which she described as, quote, more brilliant than the sun dispensing light, clearer and more intense than a crystal cup full of crystalline water, penetrated by the rays of the most glaring sun, end quote. Juan Diego fell to his knees. The lady said, speaking in his own Nahuatl language, "My son, Juan Diego, where are you going?" "Noble lady," he answered, "I'm on my way to the church at Tlatelolco to hear Mass." Then she said, quote, "You must know and be very certain in your heart, my son, that I am truly the perpetual and perfect Virgin Mary, Holy Mother of the true God, through whom everything lives, the Creator and Master of heaven and earth. I wish and intensely desire that in this place my sanctuary be erected, so that in it I may show and make known and give all my love, my compassion, my help, and my protection to the people. I am your merciful mother, the mother of all of you who live united in this land, and of all mankind, of all those who love me, of those who cry to me, of those who seek me, of those who have confidence in me. Here I will hear their weeping, their sorrow, and will remedy and alleviate their suffering, necessities, and misfortunes. And so that my intentions may be made known, you must go down to the house of the Bishop of Mexico and tell him that I sent you, and that it is my desire to have a sanctuary built here." End quote from Mary. Mary had come to claim the conquest Hernan Cortez had made in her name. She had come to call upon all now dwelling in Mexico to live united in this land, and to ask her to help them in their need, raising the shining shield of her eternal love over a people who had been victimized more than any other on earth. Juan Diego hastened to do her bidding and spoke to Bishop Zamaraga. Not surprisingly, he doubted and told the unknown he needed to come back again later at a more convenient time. Juan Diego returned to the hill of Tepeyac about sunset. The Lady of Light was waiting just as he had seen her at dawn. He urged her to send someone to the bishop more distinguished than he, and so more likely to be believed. Quote from Juan Diego, "I am only a poor man. I am not worthy of being there where you send me. Pardon me, my queen. I do not want to make your noble heart sad. I do not want to fall into your displeasure." End quote. But Mary told him that it was he and no other that she wished to send, that he should carry her message to Bishop Zamaraga again on the following day. He left her, calling her, "My dear one, my lady." The next day, December 10th, was Sunday. Mass was later in the morning. After it was over, Juan Diego went again to the bishop's house, and after much difficulty with the guards, gained admittance. The bishop questioned him, more impressed this time. But he told him that the lady must provide some proof that she really was the Mother of God. Then he sent two of his attendants to follow Juan Diego, but they lost his track. At sunset of this day, Juan Diego was back on the hill of Tepeyac again, where the lady was waiting for him and assured him that the next day she would give him the sign the bishop had asked for. But when he reached home that evening, he found his uncle Juan Bernardino very ill. All day Monday, December 11th, he cared for his uncle, rather than returning to Bishop Thimarga or to Tepeyac. Juan Bernardino thought he was going to die, and he asked his nephew to go to Tlatelolco to bring a priest to anoint him. On Tuesday morning, December 12th, Juan Diego started out, avoiding the top of Tepeyac Hill out of fear and embarrassment, because he had not kept his promise to return there. But Mary came down the side of the hill to intercept him, asking him where he was going. He explained about his uncle. She responded, "Listen and be sure, my dear son, that I will protect you. Do not be frightened nor grieve, nor let your heart be dismayed, however great the illness may be that you speak of. Am I not here? I who am your mother, and is not my help or refuge. Am I not of your kind? Do not be concerned about your uncle's illness, for he's not going to die. Be assured he is already well. Is there anything else you need? Am I not of your kind?" With these words, the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, gave back to those who had been Satan's captives their dignity and their hope. She was of their kind. She was no alien, no stranger. She was theirs. Then she told Juan Diego to climb up the hill, saying he would find flowers blooming which he should pluck and bring to her. The hill was a desert place where only cactus, thistles, and thorn brush grew. Juan Diego had never seen a flower there. But when he reached the top, it was covered with beautiful Castilian roses. If you've never seen them, they really are lovely. Touched with dew of exquisite fragrance. Mary took them from him as he gathered them, arranged them with her own hands, and put them in his cloak, or tilma, made of the fiber of the maguey cactus, and tied a knot in it behind his neck to hold the roses in place. We are vividly reminded of visualizing this, as Juan Diego very likely was reminded, as it happened, of a mother helping a little son into his fine clothes. She told him, quote, "This is the sign that you must take to the Lord Bishop. In my name, tell him that with this he will see and recognize my will, and that he must do what I ask. And you who are my ambassador are worthy of my confidence. I counsel you to take every care that you open your mouth only in the presence of the bishop. And you must make it known to him what it is that you carry, and tell him how I asked you to climb to the top of the hill to gather the flowers. Tell him also that you have seen all that you have seen, so that you will persuade the Lord Bishop, and he will see that the church is built for which I ask." End quote. When he arrived again at the bishop's house, Juan Diego was kept waiting a long time by the bishop's attendants, who eventually insisted on seeing the roses. But when they tried to take some of them, they could not, because they became not roses that they touched, but as if painted or embroidered. When they finally admitted him to the bishop's presence, Juan Diego told him all that had happened and opened his cloak. The roses cascaded to the floor, and there upon the tilma was a full portrait of the Mother of God in Indian dress, her small hands joined in prayer, her soft black hair falling gently upon her shoulders under her cape, and framing the perfect oval of her face, with half-closed eyes deep as the sea, and the rosebud mouth slightly smiling that had kissed the infant God. On Christmas Day in Bethlehem. That portrait still exists today, just as it was then, in brilliant color, the normally short-lived cactus fiber cloth untouched by the passage of 450 years. Anyone can go to Mexico City and see it. Bishop Juan de Thimarga fell to his knees. It had been given to him to see what even his supremely holy master, St. Francis of Assisi, had never seen in this life. The face and form of the Blessed Virgin Mary, her own portrait. The tears streamed down his worn cheeks as he prayed her forgiveness for having doubted her and her messenger. When he could speak and stand again, he reverently took the cloak from Juan Diego and brought it to his chapel to lay it before her son, present in the Blessed Sacrament. In 1979, A searching scientific study was made by Dr. Philip Callahan, a research biophysicist, I believe that's the field of our Dr. Haas, at the University of Florida, who is also a painter, a photographer, and a scientific writer. Photographing it extensively for the first time in infrared light, a recommended technique for the critical study of old paintings, Dr. Callahan found evidence that some minor decorations on the portrait were added or painted over later by human hands. But regarding most of the portrait, including every aspect of Mary's own face and form, Dr. Callahan's conclusion was very different. Quoting Dr. Callahan, "The mantle is of dark turquoise blue. This presents an inexplicable phenomenon because all such pigments are semi-permanent and are known to be subject to considerable fading with time, especially in hot climates. The Indian Mayan blue wall paintings are already badly faded. The blue mantle, however, is bright enough to have been laid last week. I have a picture of it at home, which was taken without a flash in the old basilica, and you can see it clear as day. I used to show it to my classes." Resuming the quote from Dr. Callahan, "The most notable feature of the robe is its remarkable luminosity. It is highly reflective of visible radiation, yet transparent to the infrared rays. As in the case of the blue mantle, the shadowing of the pink robe is blended into the paint layer, and no drawing or sketch is evident under the pink pigment. The pink pigment appears to be inexplicable. One of the really strange aspects of this painting is that not only is the tilma not sized, but there is absolutely no protective coating of varnish. Despite this unusually total lack of any protective overcoating, the robe and mantle are as bright and colored as if the paint were newly laid. The head of the Virgin of Guadalupe is one of the great masterpieces of artistic facial expression. In subtleness of form, simplicity of execution, hue, and coloring, it has few equals among the masterpieces of the world. Furthermore, there are no portraits that I have ever observed which were executed in a similar manner. One of the truly marvelous and inexplicable techniques used to give realism to the painting is the way that it takes advantage of the unsized tilma to give it depth and render it lifelike. This is particularly evident in the mouth, where a coarse fiber of the fabric is raised above the level of the rest of the weave and follows perfectly the ridge at the top of the lip. The same rough imperfections occur below the highlighted area on the left cheek and to the right and below of the right eye. I would consider it impossible that any human painter could select a tilma with imperfections of weave positioned so as to accentuate the shadows and highlights in order to impart realism. The possibility of coincidence is even more unlikely. The black of the eyes and hair cannot be iron oxide or any pigment that turns brown with age, for the paint is neither cracked nor faded with age. The truly phenomenal thing about the face and hands is the tonal quality, which is as much a physical effect from light reflecting off the coarse tilma as from the paint itself. At a distance where the pigment and surface of sculpturing blend together, the overwhelming beauty of the olive-colored Madonna emerges as if by magic. The expression suddenly appears reverent yet joyous, Indian yet European, olive-skinned yet white of hue." End of quote from Dr. Callahan. Furthermore, greatly enlarged photographs of the right eye of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the portrait have revealed 3 human figures, one of whom appears to be Juan Diego, and another his interpreter when speaking to Bishop of Zamaraga, Juan Gonzalez, who later became a zealous supporter of devotions to Our Lady Guadalupe. We have portraits of both Juan Diego and Juan Gonzalez, showing strong resemblance to 2 of these figures in the eye. While she was appearing to Juan Diego on the hill of Tepeyac, she also appeared to his uncle, Juan de Bernardino, to cure him. And when she came, he told Juan Diego later that when she came, as he lay helpless in his illness, she named herself to him as Holy Mary of Guadalupe. Guadalupe was and is one of the most significant shrines to the Blessed Virgin Mary in Spain, but has no visible connection with the apparition in Mexico, with one exception, that Queen Isabel had gone there for a spiritual retreat to that shrine before all this happened and before Columbus left, and Columbus went there later on a special pilgrimage to bring the first American Indians to be baptized. So it had very special significance in that way as a place where reaching Mexico from Spain had first been thought about, and the first Indians from Mexico were brought back. There has been much speculation that Our Lady actually used some Nahuatl word. Many suggestions have been made as to what word it might have been, which sounded to the Spanish like Guadalupe, a very Spanish word that would be hard for Nahuatl speakers to pronounce, since their language has no G and no D. All such speculation overlooks the fact that Juan Diego and his uncle were presenting their accounts of the apparition to Bishop Thamaga through a trained interpreter, Juan Gonzalez, whose native language was Nahuatl, but who also spoke Spanish well, and therefore would have been most unlikely to have misheard or mistranslated some Nahuatl name or title as Guadalupe. Therefore, this must really have been the name she chose. Perhaps as another way of showing how she wanted her children in Spain and in Mexico to draw closer together. Now we come to the dedication of the shrine itself, which she had asked to be done. Many willing hands assisted in the task of building the shrine, and a small building was ready to house the glorious image on the indicated site in less than 2 weeks. It was completed just before Christmas. Bishop Thamaga had ordered its dedication with much rejoicing and a great procession on the second day of Christmas, December 26, 1531. He sent a special invitation to Hernan Cortez and his second wife, recently come from Spain, to attend the dedication and join in the procession. The letter of invitation from Bishop Thamaga to Cortez was discovered some years ago in the immense and still not fully explored archives of the Indies in Spain by the devoted researches of the great Mexican Jesuit church historian P. Mariano Cuevas. Though not entirely clear because of its allusions to prior correspondence or conversations between the two men, not now known, it's the nearest thing we have to a contemporary document attesting to the miracle. Quoting this document, "Illustrious and most fortunate Lord, give thanks to the Lord our God, resolving to serve him more fully henceforth. Have patience tomorrow with the play we put on. It will give pleasure on the joyous nativity of our Savior. How splendid it will be. Before long I revealed it." Bishop Thamaga does not say what he revealed. Father Cuevas thinks this refers to the circumstances of the apparition, which at first he had been reluctant to discuss. And resuming the quote from Father Cuevas, "And at sunset," of the document he found, "and at sunset walked my station of St. Francis, first to the great church and then to the church of St. Dominic. The Bishop of Tlaxcala preaches tomorrow. And now I am in charge of my procession and am writing to Veracruz. It's impossible to describe the joy of everyone. It's not necessary to write to Salamanca. I sent a messenger to the custodian of the Franciscan house at Cuernavaca. An Indian has already gone to Father Toribio. All praise to God and the dances of the Indians. All praise to the name of God on the eve of this fiesta of fiestas. Say to her ladyship," Cortez's wife, "that I wish to give the great church the name of the conception of the Mother of God, since on that occasion God and his mother willed to grant this favor to this land which you won." End of quote. Father Cuevas points out that the civilian missal, which is then used in Mexico and Spain, in that missal, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception was not confined to the single day of December 8th, but like Christmas, extended over a number of days, from December 8th to 17th. Thus, the reference to the great favor from God to this land which you won, happening on the occasion of the Immaculate Conception, could refer to any event during this 10-day period, and would seem likely to refer to the apparitions which took place December 9th, 10th, and 12th. Were it not for this reference to the special favor, in Spanish merced, from God, the letter could be regarded as alluding simply to Christmas celebrations. The Guadalupan tradition, attested by several of the elderly witnesses of the formal investigation in Mexico City in 1666, which we already talked about, who reported what they had heard of the miracle from their parents and grandparents, recalls a great celebration at the first installation of the portrait in the original shrine on Tepeyac on December 26, 1531. This tradition receives considerable confirmation from this letter of Bishop Thamaga. If this be the meaning of the letter, as seems probable, it's particularly noteworthy that the great bishop made a point of paying tribute to Hernan Cortez in the direct context of Our Lady's gift of her own portrait, by speaking of Mexico, the land to which that splendid favor had been given, as the land he had won. It suggests that Bishop Zamargo believed, as we proposed here, that the victory of the Catholic army of Cortez over the gods of darkness and death was necessary before the Blessed Virgin Mary could come to Mexico. Indians and Spaniards came together to venerate the surpassingly beautiful image, children together of the Mother of all the faithful. They came on December 26, 1531, and have been coming ever since, day and night, season after season, decade after decade, century after century. Later, the Church was to proclaim Our Lady of Guadalupe the patroness of all the Americas, the whole great span from Arctic to Antarctic that the sailors and conquistadors of Catholic Spain revealed to the world. Now, what was the immediate aftermath of this apparition and this gift of the portrait? 9 million baptisms. And the Church has never seen anything like it in the whole of its missionary history. Careful records were maintained by Father Toribio Motolinia, who was already at work on his great history of the Indians of New Spain. Writing in 1536, he reports that he and one other priest had baptized 14,200 Indians in 5 days. In Mexico as a whole, he declared there had been no less than 5 million baptisms since the arrival of the 12 missionaries in 1524. Comparing this total with Fray Martin's 200,000 of 1532, it is clear that the vast majority of these baptisms took place in the 4 years from 1532 to 1536. Wherever the missionaries were, wherever they went, Indians of all ages flocked to them for baptism in unprecedented, overwhelming numbers. These numbers necessitated the omission of some elements of the usual baptismal liturgy, such as the rites of the salt and the saliva, and the use of consecrated oil, supplies of which were limited. But Father Toribio was unequivocal that every candidate was individually baptized, and every adult presenting himself for baptism was given 2 oral summaries of the catechism. Therefore, instruction, though brief, was never lacking. Nor was any pressure, to say nothing of force, employed. You still hear people tell you this is all done by force. There's no basis for that in history whatsoever. On the contrary, it was the missionaries who were pressured and almost unbearably overburdened by the tide of converts, so much greater than they had prepared for or ever expected so soon. We hear of Indians coming to them for baptism when they approached villages for the first time, before their preaching had even begun. The flood of baptisms continued all during the remaining years of the life of Juan Diego and Bishop Zamargo, who died within a few days of each other in the spring of 1548. By then, the number of baptized Indians in Mexico was approximately 9 million. The validity of the baptism with abbreviated liturgy performed during this period was confirmed by a bull of Pope Paul I in 1537. Though most conventional historians of Mexico today prefer not to mention Our Lady of Guadalupe, or at least not at the point in time when she appeared, it should be self-evident that this immense surge of baptisms, beginning in 1532, these millions of Indians suddenly seeking out the sacrament of Christian initiation with an overwhelming desire, even when not yet in contact with the missionaries, where most of them had previously held back despite the best efforts of the missionaries and the prestige of the conquerors, derived primarily from the impact of the apparition and the portrait, once news of them had spread throughout the land during the course of the year 1532. The Franciscans at this time recognized and honored Our Lady of Guadalupe. They organized a procession to her shrine to pray for relief from an epidemic in 1544. Juan Diego devoted the rest of his life to the constant care of the little sanctuary where the sacred image was kept. He became famed among the Indians for his sanctity, and is represented in their contemporary picture writing with the signs of a holy man. Gabriel Suarez, an Indian, testified at the hearing of 1666 at the age of 110 that his father, Mateo Suarez, had known Juan Diego well, living memory again, had seen the sacred image while Juan Diego was still living, and, quote, and knew many who had gone to the hermitage to ask Juan Diego to pray for them. Now the church is asking Juan Diego to pray for us. Another witness at the 1666 hearings, Pablo Juarez, chief of Cuautitlan, whose grandmother had been a close friend of Juan Diego and who had grown up in that town, said the apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe was, quote, a matter so public and well known how it all happened that even the children sang all about it in their games, end quote. And we have the will of Juana Martin of Cuautitlan, a relative of Juan Diego, a nearly contemporary document dated March 11, 1559, which mentions Juan Diego and declares that, quote, through him the miracle took place over there in Tepeyac, where the beloved Holy Mary appeared, whose lovely image we see at Guadalupe, who is really ours, and of our town of Cuautitlan. And now with all my heart, my soul, and my will, I give to her majesty all that is really mine. I give it all to the Virgin of Tepeyac, end quote. The result of the 9 million baptisms by the time of the death of Juan Diego and Bishop Tamarga in 1548 was the creation of large Christian Indian communities throughout most of central Mexico, where a substantial majority of the population was now Christian. They were usually separate from the Spanish communities, with great church monastery complexes around the Indian dwellings, around which the Indian dwellings were gathered. The churches were decorated by Indian artists with frescoes and sculptures, a universe removed from the horrors they had painted and carved in the days of the hummingbird wizard. The liturgy was celebrated with music played and sometimes composed by the Indians and dramatized by Nahuatl plays. The numbers of the new Indian Catholic communities were limited only by the number of the missionaries and of the Indian assistants who could be trusted to lead such communities in the absence of a Spanish priest or lay brother. It is not at all surprising that in later years it was found that some of the new converts had later secretly apostatized, and that the old religion was not entirely dead. That could have been expected. The truly significant fact is the vast extent, the general depth, and above all, the historical endurance of the conversion. In the 15 years after the appearance of Our Lady of Guadalupe on Tepeyac Hill, the 9 million baptisms she inspired created Catholic Mexico, Indian as much as Spanish, devoted, indestructible, surviving devastating epidemics and long-continued economic oppression, and even the terrible mistake of the Spanish church and the governmental authorities in later deciding after Bishop Tamarga's death not to ordain native priests. That's the reason for the priest shortage in Latin America to this day. In more recent times, Catholic Mexico has survived revolutionary and bitterly anti-Catholic governments, ever continuing to draw strength and grace from the inexhaustible fountain of both, whose gentle faces glowed undimmed for more than 450 years on Juan Diego's tilma. You're taught as Catholics that Our Lady's heel crushes the serpent. You couldn't ask in all of history of a more complete proof of that than this story. Thank you very much.